Thank you very much for waiting, ladies and gentlemen. We would now like to move into Session 1, Plenary Discussion, Geoeconomics and Japan Strategy. We will have keynote speech and then panel discussion to follow. First of all, on U.S.-China relations and geoeconomics, the U.S.-Japan alliance in a new situation. We are privileged to have Ambassador Robert D. Blackwill, Henry A. Kissinger Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council of Foreign Relations. Ambassador Blackwill, please.
Thank you very much. I'm honored that the Asia-Pacific Initiative has invited me to give this virtual presentation on U.S.-China relations and geoeconomics, the U.S.-Japan alliance in a new situation. I look forward to our discussion of these critically important issues and to my next actual visit to Japan, which I hope will be soon. Before I directly address Beijing's geoeconomics challenge, I want first to review the strategic threat that China, in my view, poses to the West and what the United States, Japan, and others should do about it. Put simply, the U.S., Japan, and their partners must conduct a balancing strategy that deliberately limits China's capacity to misuse its growing power, even as the United States, Japan, and their allies continue to interact with China diplomatically and economically. China's sustained economic success over the last 30-odd years has enabled it to aggregate formidable power, making it the nation most capable of dominating the Asian continent, thus undermining the traditional Western and U.S. geopolitical objective of ensuring that this vast area remains free of hegemonic control. The meteoric growth of the Chinese economy, even if Chinese per capita income remains behind that of the United States, has already provided Beijing with the resources necessary to challenge the security of both its Asian neighbors and Washington's influence in Asia with potentially dangerous consequences. Of all nations, and in most conceivable scenarios, China represents and will remain the most significant strategic competitor for the United States and Japan. China's rise already has bred geopolitical, military, economic, and ideological challenges to U.S. power, U.S. allies, and the U.S.-formulated rule-based international order. China's continued success in the future would further undermine U.S. and allied national interests. Lee Kuan Yew put it this way regarding whether Chinese leaders are serious about displacing the United States as the #1 power in Asia and in the world, quote, "Of course, why not? They have transformed a poor society by an economic miracle to become now the second largest economy in the world, on track, as Goldman Sachs has predicted, to become the world's largest economy. They have followed the American lead into putting people in space and shooting down satellites with missiles. Theirs is a culture 4,000 years old, with 1.3 billion people, with a huge and very talented pool to draw from. How could they not aspire to be #1 in Asia and in time, the world," unquote. The profound test that Chinese power represents for the United States and its allies, including Japan and friends in the Indo-Pacific, is likely to last for decades. Beijing seeks to achieve these strategic goals: to replace the United States as the primary power in Asia, to weaken the U.S. alliance system in Asia, to undermine the confidence of Asian nations in U.S. credibility, reliability, and staying power, to use China's economic power to pull Asian nations closer to China's geopolitical policy preferences, to increase PRC military capability to strengthen deterrence against U.S. military intervention in the region, especially regarding Taiwan, to cast doubt on the U.S. economic model, and to ensure U.S. democratic values do not diminish the CCP's hold on domestic power. It is unsettling to frankly recognize that in China in recent years has made significant progress to advance some of its strategic objectives. The United States and like-minded nations must urgently act in ways that stop this Chinese momentum and regain long-term initiatives in the Indo-Pacific. Policy experts critical of this analysis will argue that China has no grand strategy. Although there may be those in Beijing who disagree with China's current strategic approach, its dominating elements are not a mystery. Chinese officials insistently argue that the U.S. alliance system in Asia is a product of the Cold War and should be dismantled, that the United States' Asian allies and friends should loosen their U.S. ties, and that failure to do so will inevitably produce a negative Chinese reaction, that U.S. efforts to maintain its current presence and power in Asia are dimensions of an American attempt to contain China and must therefore be condemned and resisted, that U.S. military power projection in the region is dangerous and should be reduced, while the PLA continues to build up its military capabilities with the clear objective of reducing U.S. military options, including in the context of a U.S.-China confrontation over Taiwan, and that the U.S. economic model is fundamentally exploitative and should have no application in Asia. Not to take seriously official Chinese government statements along these lines is not to take China seriously. That Beijing does not hope to realize these policy goals in the short term does not reduce their potential undermining effect in the decades ahead. In short, if China were to achieve the policy objectives contained in these official statements, it would clearly replace the United States as Asia's leading power. If that does not represent a Chinese grand strategy, what would? At the same time, let me make clear I do not support an effort to contain China. Indeed, the current challenge that China poses is so fundamentally different than that of the Soviet Union that the Cold War concept of containment has little practical application to Beijing's current destabilizing policies in the Indo-Pacific. I hope politicians and experts will stop using the term Cold War regarding China. It confuses rather than clarifies. In short, as the Biden administration has recently stressed, the United States, Japan, and others should work together not to contain China, but rather to make it systematically accountable for its actions which seek to undermine the West's vital national interests and democratic values. It is in this evolving economic and strategic setting that Beijing attempts to use geoeconomic measures fundamentally to alter the security situation in the Indo-Pacific to China's lasting benefit at the expense of the United States, Japan, and many others. Geoeconomics is a transcendent foreign policy phenomenon today as nations increasingly use economic instruments rather than traditional diplomatic and military actions to pursue their tactical and strategic objectives. However, the term geoeconomics often does not have a clear definition, even among experts. With this in mind, in our book on the subject, War by Other Means, Geoeconomics and Statecraft, Jennifer Harris and I offer the following definition of geoeconomics: the use of economic instruments to promote and defend national interests and to produce advantageous geopolitical outcomes. Use instruments to produce geopolitical outcomes. Incidentally, our audience will be interested that my co-author, Jennifer Harris, is now at the White House in charge of international economic policy. Today, 7 economic tools are suited to geopolitical application: trade policy, investment policy, economic and financial sanctions, cyber tools, economic assistance, financial and monetary policy, national policies governing energy and commodities. Geoeconomics owes its modern resurgence primarily to 3 factors. The first is today's major powers, especially China, use economic instruments as a crucial means to project influence and conduct geopolitical combat. The second is that compared to previous eras, those statements most prone to economic displays of power, especially China, have vastly more resources at their direct disposal, including state-owned enterprises. And third, today's market exert much more influence than ever before over a nation's foreign policy choices and outcomes. As you all know, there are many examples in countries in the Indo-Pacific area that revise policies or remain silent so as not to upset Beijing and risk loss of access to the largest economy in Asia. A recent study by the Center for Global Development of 100 BRI contracts found uniquely restrictive secrecy requirements and clauses that could allow Chinese entities to influence the policy of debtor nations. In 2016, the Sultanate of Brunei, in exchange for $6 billion from China, apparently agreed not to comment on China's construction of artificial islands in the South China Sea and to censor journalists who criticize Beijing. In 2016, the Mongolian government apologized for the Dalai Lama's visit to Ulaanbaatar and indicated it would not allow a visit by the Tibetan spiritual leader. Indeed, for more than a decade, most EU governments have refused to meet the Dalai Lama for fear of Chinese economic reprisal. In 2017, after South Korea deployed a terminal high-altitude area defense missile defense system, China curtailed group tours to South Korea and limited imports of certain Korean products into China. In 2017, Beijing used BRI loans to coerce the government of Sri Lanka to sign over the port of Hambantatoa, giving China a shipyard on the southern tip of Sri Lanka with access to the Indian Ocean, a strategic advantage for China. Muslim majority countries with strong economic ties to China complained little when the PRC claimed territory in the South China Sea and have muted their criticisms of China's repressive actions toward the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. In 2018, when a Chinese delegation visited Hanoi to warn the Vietnamese government not to allow Spanish oil company Repsol to drill in its exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea, Vietnam ended the project, costing Repsol $200 million. In 2018, the U.S. hotel chain Marriott and clothing outfitter Gap apologized to the PRC after the companies made reference to Taiwan as separate from the PRC. In Cambodia, Hungary, and Serbia, China has essentially bought off governments through corrupt business practices and bent them toward Beijing policies. When the UK protested against oppressive Chinese policies in Hong Kong, Beijing sought to punish Britain through punitive economic measures. When Australia called for an international investigation that would study the sources of the COVID-19 pandemic, China responded with tariffs on Australia barley and beef exports. When foreign companies recently announced that they would no longer use Chinese cotton grown in Xinjiang, Beijing promoted internal boycotts that essentially ended the company's business in China. And just last week, in a sterling example of China's wolf warrior diplomacy, the Chinese ambassador in Dhaka warned the Bangladesh government it would substantially damage its relations with Beijing if it showed interest in the Asian Quad. We know that China's strength at the UN General Assembly and other UN organizations is importantly based on Beijing's inherent capability to economically punish smaller countries that vote against China's policy preferences. And as you all know, China's use of geoeconomic tools in the past decade, including suspension of rare earth exports and organized boycotts of Japanese cars and other manufactured goods, attempted to coerce Tokyo to change its policies concerning the Senkaku Islands. All these examples, and I could give you many more, and many more are in the book that Jennifer Harris and I wrote, demonstrate Beijing's use of its enormous economic weight to attempt to force nations to adopt its geopolitical preferences. But China's geoeconomic pressure is not always successful. Just a few years ago, China was touted as a growth opportunity for Australian businesses. But recently, as you know, the Australian foreign minister invalidated a pair of Victoria's investment agreements with China that were, quote, inconsistent with Australian foreign policy or adverse to our foreign relations, unquote. In this case, China's coercion not only failed to change Australia's policies, but it also prompted the government in Canberra to step in and reverse Beijing's previous gains. Other countries that welcome China's Belt and Road Initiative find themselves disappointed as the pandemic has forced more nations to refinance their investment deals with China. These countries worry that the PRC will take advantage of their distress through debt trap coercive diplomacy. When it was unveiled in 2015, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor was heralded as a signature BRI project. Now this project faces a backlash in Pakistan, and Prime Minister Imran Khan has asked Beijing to renegotiate investment terms. Thanks to Tokyo's effort, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership creates a free trade area that would allow signatories to resist Beijing's economic coercion more effectively. And there's one more incandescent, clear, powerful example of China's failed geoeconomic coercion over a long period. I have in mind the prolonged determination of the Taiwan government and people not to succumb to relentless Chinese pressure to join the mainland. China has, in the last decade in particular, and with the current Taiwan government in particular, embarked on a punishing geoeconomic coercion of Taiwan. But what is the effect of all these intimidating measures on the citizens of Taiwan? Every poll demonstrates that Taiwanese, year by year, are ever more resolute, ever more opposed to joining the People's Republic of China. Colleagues, I hope I have now prepared the way to propose 20 specific policies the United States, Japan, and similarly minded countries should now employ to meet China's geoeconomic pressures. These countries, the United States, Japan, and other like-minded states should, one, avoid efforts to get nations to refuse BRI as a matter of principle. Although some countries have turned down BRI in recent years, many developing nations need the money. Attempts to get others to reject funding will often fail, just as did the campaign to boycott China's AIIB. Two, coordinate international investment campaigns with regional partners to provide viable alternatives to Belt and Road funding in strategically important areas. While the West and its partners in the Indo-Pacific cannot match the size of BRI, they can use the strength of their alliances to determine what development targets in key regions need to be met and where to direct funding. Three, ratify and expand multilateral trade deals that exclude China. Four, use the positive power of the innovation and networks of the advanced economies to attract other nations. Five, begin a consultative process among allies to identify geoeconomic vulnerabilities and to design resiliency and diversification efforts to address those vulnerabilities. Six, diversify supply chains through regional trade partnerships. Seven, create a coalition of like-minded nations who could provide direct support to countries suffering the effects of PRC geoeconomic action. Eight, continue anti-dumping cases against China and WTO action against Chinese subsidies to state-run firms, as well as technology transfers, forced technology transfers. Nine, punish China's geoeconomics coercion by imposing punitive retaliatory tariffs on Chinese exports. 10, help countries assess the viability and sustainability of BRI projects. 11, formalize mechanisms to gather information on Chinese geoeconomic practice toward companies and foreign governments and share those findings with partner countries and with publics. 12, enhance intelligence sharing for Chinese cyber threats. 13, collaborate on viable alternatives to China's 5G technologies. 14, work with India to counterbalance Chinese geoeconomic activity in the Indian Ocean region and elsewhere. 15, the United States and Japan should strengthen their alliance. No other U.S. relationship approaches that with Japan in maintaining the current balance of power in Asia to deal with the rise of Chinese power, including its geoeconomic dimensions. The fact that Prime Minister Suga was the first foreign leader to visit the Biden White House shows that both countries face a clear priority on their partnership. 16, the United States and Japan should substantially expand their security cooperation to encompass all of Asia. 17, the United States and Japan should seek to avoid major trade disputes. 18, the United States and Japan should bolster cooperation with Vietnam, Australia, India, and other nations concerned with the rise of Chinese power. 19, the United States and Japan should rethink some of its most basic premises about power projection and economics. They need to strengthen the many elements of geoeconomics in their foreign policies. 20, the United States and Japan should increase economic assistance as a geopolitical instrument in their foreign policies. Let me say that in my prepared remarks and in the speech, which will eventually be online, you'll see much more detail on each of these 20. Let me conclude in just 2 minutes, and again, there'll be more detail about this in the prepared remarks, but I want to say just a bit about diplomacy and its role. And I'll sum it up like this. If there's no willingness by either the US or China to take the other's vital national interests into account, to show restraint, the road opens to sustained confrontation and perhaps in extremis, even military conflict. But such a dangerous outcome is not inevitable. It can be avoided if the political leadership in Beijing and Washington display sustained caution in a conceptual framework with these objectives. The two countries, United States and China, should construct off-ramps through diplomacy to avert confrontations over mutually incompatible vital national interests. Avoid making subsidiary issues tests of national strength and prestige. Compromise on less important matters. Muzzle inflamed public rhetoric by governments regarding the policies of the other. Search for areas to cooperate intensively on global governance, such as climate change, public health, the world economy, and non-proliferation. Except for the foreseeable future, the United States and China will have incompatible political systems and two fundamentally opposed concepts about the sources of political legitimacy and how best to organize societies, and therefore regime change as a policy objective in word and deed should be rejected. In short, while we are carrying out these balancing policies toward China, while we are pursuing a whole variety of means to blunt China's use of geoeconomic instruments for political purposes, at the same time, we need to pursue an active diplomatic interaction with Beijing. The perilous, even catastrophic alternative to this mutual accommodation between the United States and China is clear for all to see. The United States and Japan should do everything they can to avoid these worst-case outcomes while stoutly defending their vital national interests and democratic values. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your comments and our discussion.